It's really great to see so many of you back. Some new faces tonight, which is wonderful. I'm very biased in this, but I think this has been a wonderful mini-series. And when we started this 2 years ago now, it was a bit of a sort of an experiment that brought back some of what we used to do in the mid-'80s with the sort of old Center for Catholic Experience. So I think it's been a wonderful hit. So I think we'll do this again next year. So when you see the lecture series come out next year, hopefully there'll be a equally intriguing, interesting lecture mini-series that we can continue some thinking beyond just a simple 45-minute lecture and sort of developing of thought. And Peter's been wonderful. I think we'll all agree in this year's version of the mini-series. Before we get started with this evening, I want to mention a couple of things because I'm so prone to forget things at the end of lectures. So out in the foyer, we have a number of tables. One table when you came in is the greeter's table where you'll find a donation basket. These lectures are free, but obviously they cost somebody something. So if you're getting something out of these lectures in which to give back to the university that supports this outreach, please do so. Anything that you give to St. Jerome's over $10 or more will be tax receipted. Please use the envelopes that are in your chairs if you want to give a donation, so we have your contact information and so on. The other tables that you will find out there is a fairly traded coffee and chocolate table, one of my favorites, and it's sponsored by the University Catholic community, and see them on their way out. They have some wonderful products. They're here every Friday that we have one of these lectures, so purchase your chocolate and coffee and get your caffeine fix for the next little while. And the other table that we have out here is the Beyond Borders table. 3 wonderful students who would love to talk to you about some of the work that they're going to be doing this summer in places all over the world. Beyond Borders is our international experiential learning program rooted in social justice. These students will go out and work with community development groups around the world, doing some truly amazing things. These are truly amazing people. Get to know them on your way out. This is what I think is what Catholic education is really about. Going out and serving others with the knowledge and skills and gifts that they have. So really a wonderful group of people. What else? Lectures that are coming up. I mentioned last week that Austin Clark, the author Austin Clark, will be here on February 5th speaking at 7:30. He's got a new book out entitled More, I believe. If that's wrong, let me know. Apparently it's a wonderful book. He's going to be here as a part of the Canada Reads project that's also sponsored by the St. Jerome's English department. So if you can make it to Austin Clark on February 5th, please do so. Another lecture that actually isn't going to be at St. Jerome's, but is going to be sponsored by St. Jerome's and the St. Jerome's Center for Responsible Citizenship. Gregory Baum will be in Waterloo on February 12th. He will be over across the street at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. Good Lutherans in the crowd are going, oh yeah, hey, good, yeah. Shout out for the Lutherans. Gregory will be speaking on the topic of Islam and democracy, a Catholic perspective on Islamic reform. And there he'll be talking about the author, theologian, Tariq Ramadan. Some of you may have heard of Tariq Ramadan. He's been in the news quite recently. He was a Muslim scholar who was denied an entry visa into the United States in 2004. And he also had a job at Notre Dame University, and the U.S. government denied him an entry visa. Just this week, the State Department announced that restriction has been lifted. He is now able to apply for a visa. So it'll be a very contemporary topic that Gregory will be speaking on February 12th. Again, that's at 10:30 in the morning in the chapel at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. And finally, as a part of this series in Catholic Experience, we have Dr. Vincent Miller speaking on the topic of Where Are We? Responsibility in a Global Age. And he will be doing that here on March 5th at 7:30. So if you can make one or any of these lectures, I invite you to do so. They're wonderful talks, all of them. So, to tonight's final talk by Dr. Peter Erb. We've been introducing Peter, so I want to keep it short. So he hates these kind of introductions, but I'll so I'll keep it short. Peter C. Erb is a graduate of Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies and the University of Toronto. Peter and his wife Betty make their home in Waterloo. From 1971 to 1984, Peter was a faculty member in the Department of English at Wilfrid Laurier University. In 1984, he became a faculty member in Laurier's Department of Religion and Culture, a position he held until 2008. He has recently retired as a visiting professor of Catholic Studies through St. Dunstan's University in the University of Prince Edward Island, where he worked from 2004 to 2009. Peter continues to teach and direct students through the Waterloo Lutheran Seminary and the Toronto School of Theology. Peter is the author and editor of some 15 books and numerous articles. His current academic interests tend to revolve around Catholic and Anglo-Catholic theology. He is also, once again, and he mentioned this last week to me, and I was very fascinated, he is also once again undertaking a study of the Funken brothers and some of the correspondences and writings that they had. And why is that important to us at St. Jerome's? Well, the Funkens founded St. Jerome's University in the 19th century. So he's going back to that, and he worked on this project once upon a time, left some of that in our archives here, and he's going to be picking that back up, which is wonderful for St. Jerome's. He also spends a great deal of time, perhaps too much time, reading murder mysteries and cheap comic thrillers. He won't disagree with that. It should come to no surprise to us that Peter holds an Outstanding Teacher Award at Wilfrid Laurier University. It is indeed an honor for St. Jerome's University to be hosting Peter tonight as he leads us into part 3 of his latest project, Facing a Secular Age, Notes for the Modern Sceptic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Erb.
You can. Okay. No. That's okay? That one's off? Or all right, okay.
Sorry about that.
We're going to try to get this thing going here. And worked for the last 2 weeks. Oops. There we are. That'll do us. Okay. We'll leave that on for just a minute or so while I make a few comments. First of all, quite seriously, I want to thank all of you who are here tonight, and certainly those who have been here for the last several weeks, for your questions that have come to me through email and at other points after and sometimes before the talks. And I've appreciated them greatly, and they've been very, very helpful. Some of you were writing me notes this week saying the least you could do, Herb, is explain the sources from which you were stealing all your stuff. And so I think I should do that right away. For the last 2 weeks, I was going to do this and didn't. I obviously have stolen the term secular age from this book, A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher. But any of you who've plowed through this book will know that, and have heard me for the last 2 weeks, will know that there's no particular relationship between what I have to say about a secular age and what Charles Taylor has to say about a secular age. At any rate, I don't think I'd recommend that book for you in any case. If you're really going to read Charles Taylor, I think you should read his best book, and that's Sources of the Self. There's an awful lot of what I've been saying that's in the last part of Sources of the Self, and you can see my dependency on it there. One thing that's quite different between Charles Taylor and myself is he has a theory of retrieval. We both have a different view of the past. He has a vision of retrieval. I have a vision of resourcing or ressourcement. Having mentioned that, I would just like to make a quick advertisement for any of you who are interested in kind of ressourcement questions. We're having a gathering on February 14th. If you or your spouse have nothing to do on that particular day, you might be able to manage to come over to Our Lady of Lourdes Parish Hall, where Father Gilles Mongeau will be there giving a talk on St. Thomas Aquinas on nature and grace. This is part of our Waterloo Communio Circle. We try to get together once a month, and we try to have general gatherings about twice a year on a Sunday afternoon. And if you'd like to keep up with our mailing list, Andrea says that she has a sheet at the back. If you just put your email on there, I'll make sure you get the advertisements as well for the Communio group. What I'd like to do before I start tonight is sum up a little bit of the last 2 weeks. And over the last 2 weeks, I have been looking at this question of the secular age, or facing the secular age, from the point of view of a Christian. How do we face the secular age and how do we understand it? And I've been trying to do it in sort of 2 lines. The first week I looked a fair bit at the history of the matter, at history. I took a historical view. The second week, a more theological view. As all of you who were here the first week know, I suggested that our history, the history that I was looking at, I began in the 16th century. Now, the 16th century for me, this being the week of Prayer for Christian Unity, the 16th century for me is not so much a problem so much because of the break in the Western Church as it is for a number of other things that occurred. I mean, anyone who comes from a Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, you can work it out right away what the problem is, right? The Middle Ages died and this wretched modern age came into being. But in the 16th century, my argument has been a number of changes took place. There was a movement from a primarily contemplative point of view to a primary view interest in ordinary life. There was a movement from traditional rights to legal rights, and that brought with it a difference in patriarchy as well, a kind of patriarchy that was based on last names, let's say, and the man's last name. There was a shift from the primacy of the community to the primacy of the individual, a movement in the development of the new nation states. There was a movement, as I suggested last week, from a society which was primarily oral to a society which moved towards sight as the primary function, particularly in reading and elsewhere. There was a movement from creedal Christianity to confessional Christianity, and a number of other shifts, certainly great shifts in developing the new sciences, and we'll look a little bit tonight again at this question of the new science. Within these shifts, between roughly 1500 and 1600, my suggestion was that within these shifts, we get a new form of Christianity, both in the Catholic world and in the, for the moment we'll say, non-Catholic Christian traditions. That is in Baroque Catholicism and in Protestantism. And my argument was the first week that what happens as this becomes intensified, it starts in the early 1600s, it becomes intensified in the late 18th century, early 19th century with the Enlightenment and the Romantic era. As this shift to modernity becomes intensified, Christianity on the whole begins to shift as well, trying to explain itself in terms of all the new changes that have come, and as a result, shifting certain views against which an old atheism can set itself up. One of my arguments the first week was particularly that what happens is we get a Unitarian God, a deist God, a single God, over against the Christian Trinity. We get a historical Jesus, for the most part, over against an incarnate God-man. And what happens as we shift to defend ourselves in terms of the language of the day is we put ourselves in a position in which we can be easily attacked, in which people can deny the God we believe in, but as they're denying this God, they're in fact, my suggestion was, denying not the Christian God, but a deist God. So there's that old atheism that I suggested, is a kind of anti-Christianity more than it is an atheism. Now that fairly much was the argument of the first week. And I know that there are some problems with the way in which I set it up. One of you in an email said, "My God, Herb, you're a Marxist. This is a Marxist theory of history." Well, yes, you're right, it is. Except I've always thought that the Marxist theory of history was just a twisted version of the Christian concept, or rather the Catholic concept of tradition. But at any rate, We'll argue about that at some other point. That should get some emails going if nothing else does. Now, over against this, I also argue that we're facing, now in the 20th century, what I call a new atheism. An atheism that has much more in common with Christianity and with traditional Christianity than we might suspect. And so I throw up on the screen for you this evening, immediately, a picture of two old white guys. They aren't quite dead white guys yet, but they're old. So it's surprising I have them up there because I'm really just interested in old dead white European guys. But we have these two people here. This man here, the picture's taken, of course, in Munich, in the Catholic Center of Studies, and this is 2004. This man on the, sorry, I'm trying to get my little stick the thing out of the way there. Yeah. This man on the left is the Marxist Jürgen Habermas, and the man on the right, of course, is Joseph Ratzinger. Now, they have a lot more in common than you might expect. For example, if those of you, particularly Catholics among you, who have serious questions about the whole question of life issues, you might be quite fascinated by picking up an atheist Marxist book, Jürgen Habermas, and reading The Future of Human Nature. There'll be much more in there that you'll agree with than you'll disagree with. And it's a Marxist atheist who's writing it. During this discussion that went on, and we have by the way, if you're tired of that, if you don't like that, you can also look at Jürgen Habermas's collection of essays called Religion and Rationality, which is also quite an interesting volume to look at. But the lecture, the talks that these two men had with one another have been published now under this title, The Dialectics of Secularization on Reason and Religion. And one of the most interesting things, which I'll be taking up again this evening, is Ratzinger's position on natural law, in which he puts forward an argument that completely shocked most traditional Catholics and suggests the possibility of a new look at natural law. When I finally get through this summation, I'll eventually try to get to that and show you how I understand that. Is it all right to attack that? We'll see. We'll see how it'll go. In the second week, I moved the argument from a primarily historical argument to a theological one, in which I tried to argue that the traditional division, or the division rather between faith and reason, that had come into being in the 17th century, in which faith is set over against reason. Reason's the thing, you got reasons for certain things, and faith is just what you believe in that you got no reasons for. That this is not a useful division, and that in fact, the more we're thinking about it in most recent days, reason and faith stand together. I suggested that in Vatican II, this suggestion about dealing with the new atheism, people like Habermas perhaps, although he wasn't on the scene at that point, in the way in which Vatican II was talking about it, have much more in common with Christianity than we expect. And for this, I used the example of John Henry Newman, to which we'll come back again this evening at a number of times. Now, what I was suggesting was that faith and reason belong together. Here is a statue by De Verrocchio, which we showed a picture of in the first period. This is in Florence. And you'll see here the great figure of Thomas, so-called Doubting Thomas. But I don't like the term Doubting Thomas. What Thomas is saying is, I want to see the wounds that are in your side. And here Thomas is looking to the wounds in his side. This is the aspect of investigation, of observation. The belief within Catholic Christianity, at least, that there is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. In the Catholic faith, in particular, the belief is very, very strong that you can't hop away from the senses. There is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. And so Thomas isn't really, in some sense, for the moment tonight, let's not use him as a doubting Thomas. Let's use him as an investigating, questioning, real, genuine Christian Thomas, checking out the wounds in the side. And the wounds in the side that he sees there, followed up the arm, point him to above. Thomas is still living in a world of the transcendent. This world and the world above are not split in half. Now, we'll see a similar picture of Thomas when we look at Caravaggio's Doubting Thomas. Here, however, this is a post-16th century picture. And here you'll notice that there's nothing moving up. Thomas is checking out the wounds. This is pure nature. And some of you who were here before will remember my division between nature and grace, and that Raphael picture, which we'll come to later, where the division was cut off sharply, and God's in his heaven above, and there's clouds there, and the nature is below. What happens is that we tend to come to live in a world of nature, and we leave out the transcendent. Here is a picture after the 16th century turn, in which the transcendent is in one sense no longer there. There's this sharp, clinical investigation of the wounds that Thomas is doing, and he's even got our Lord looking down. There's no transcendent. There is, of course, a transcendent, because you ask yourself, where is the light coming from? The light has to be coming from somewhere above. But as far as the rationalists here on earth, the scientists, the individualists, they couldn't care less about it. They're interested in what they see there. What we need then is, how do you put together observation, very, very, very careful observation, with contemplation? These two are sisters, needless to say, and they belong together in the same family. That's my argument. Wonder whose kids those are. At any rate, this is the man that I brought forward as the individual who tried to put these two questions together. Now, this individual, John Henry Newman, last week I suggested to you, and I'm moving now from last week to this week, I suggested to you, had a wonderful motto. The motto was, cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart, mind does not speak to mind. Heart speaks to heart. This is the way we need to carry on our ecumenical relations. This is the way we need to carry on our conversation with those who are not Christians, of all sorts. Heart, cor ad, heart to heart, speaks. Last week, as some of you know, I made a great emphasis on Newman's motto, cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. In fact, a Lutheran friend of mine was somewhat concerned about this, since he suggested that it really should be cor ad cordem loquitur, and that Newman, he thought, got his Latin wrong. Well, what can you expect of a Lutheran? Newman had his Latin right. Nevertheless, we should look today at the picture of Newman's motto, which I have here on the screen now. As you'll see, there are three hearts within a large heart, and it's cor ad, cor towards, and then cor at the bottom, and loquitur over on the other side. The three hearts in the middle are, of course, the Trinity. The sketchy piece in the middle, the zigzag pattern, is the crown of thorns. That is part there of the suffering heart that Newman was talking about, the sacred heart. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And cor ad cor loquitur simply means that this heart speaks to the heart. It is both the heart of God speaking to the heart of man, and the heart of the human person speaking to the heart of God. But of course, it also means the rhetorical structure of only a heart speaks to a heart in any kind of evangelical or catechetical or normal human relationship. Now, I want to take a little bit of time on this motto to look at this word ad that is in this piece. Heart speaks to the heart. And to do that, I want to take a look at an early Augustinian and early Christian pattern of understanding human nature. For Augustine and for many of the early Christians, the heart of a person, or the center of the person, or what made a person, was threefold. A human being is created toward the image of God. Ad, the Latin word ad, toward the image of God, or in the image of God. And this is what creates human dignity. That is why in Catholic circles, human dignity always comes before human rights. Human rights is a secondary matter. It is based upon, it's very, very important, of course, but it's based upon the fact that we have dignity, that the dignity of the human person And the human person has dignity because that human person, the heart of the person, is created in and toward the image of God. Now, this image of God can be understood in a threefold way. It is, first of all, a memory, secondly, an intellect, and thirdly, a will. The memory of the human being is that by which the human being inevitably sinks into the origin that human being is. And of course, you remember from last week we talked a fair bit about origins. Here is an origin, however, and the origin is ultimately God. All human beings are inevitably, simply because they're human beings, remembering in some way or other their beginnings, which are with the Creator God. Secondly, in this center of this heart, the second part, since we're created in the threefold image of God, the Trinity of God, we have an intellect. And the intellect is that which seeks the highest truth. Thirdly, we have a will, or a voluntas. It's not a very good English translation, voluntary, but the voluntas is the will, and it's that which tends into the highest good. So that all human beings, simply as being human beings, have dignity and must be respected for that dignity, because they are created in the image of God and toward the image of God, the final image of God, of course, being the person of Jesus, the Christ. At the beginning of time, God was creating the world. Like an artist, he had his eye on the perfection of humanity, the perfect heart, as it were, and the perfect image of God, and human beings were created toward that image, namely the person of the glorified Christ. In fullness, and that's the pattern towards which we all move. We then inevitably sink back and look towards our origins. In God, we seek the highest truth toward God. God is the highest truth, and we are drawn, or we tend into intention toward the highest good, which is, of course, God as well. Maybe we should bring back the Sacred Heart again. I love the Sacred Heart prayers, by the way, but then most of you know I'm somewhere as a Catholic to the right of the Society of Pius X, and but the Sacred Heart is a terribly important image here, and that is what Newman has in mind in this picture, the Sacred Heart. Now, the heart then, this is the Sacred Heart here. This is Christ. And within Christ, of course, by the doctrine of perichoresis or coinherence, all three members of the Trinity are inherent in this one. The heart moves toward this heart, but there's no statement made. This heart here moves down to this heart, which is also a human heart, and that is where we have the loquitur, or the logos, or the speech of God itself. Now, we'll be coming back to various aspects of this evening as I go along, but that is what this is about. Newman knows about the Sacred Heart. While I'm on this, I should make one point. It came up in a number of notes to me, and it also came up partially in the formal questions last week. One thing we have to remember when we're doing Catholic theology is a wonderful, wonderful phrase, and that is that in Catholicism, the Marian dimension precedes the Petrine. The Marian dimension of the Church precedes the Petrine. Now, the difficulty is when we talk about Catholic theology today, everybody wants to talk about the Vatican. That's secondary to the Marian function of it. If you don't believe me, this is in the Catechism. You can look it up. Okay? This whole business of some little hole in a wall way up here in a Roman city with a blot of a picture yelling out on a Sunday afternoon at 12 noon is important for organizing and orienting the church. It's the Petrine question of the church. But this is the center of the church. The sacramental function, growth in holiness. As Hannah Arendt once said, we must always remember when we are looking at authority that authority inevitably remains powerless. So what we're looking at here is not the small dot we saw before, but the heart of the church, which is at the center of the church. And this is where Newman was particularly centered. Now, having made those little introductory statements, I want to move on to the few comments I have this evening. And you all say, ha, few. We want to look back at Newman again. And what I want to do is two things. First of all, I want to look a little more detail on the movement from reason to consciousness and from conscious faith to science. That's the first topic I want to look at tonight. And the second thing I want to look at tonight with you is the movement, if I can find it in my notes here, I'm sorry, I've already done the first part. Good heavens, I wanted to look at the first point I want to look at is the dignity of the human person. That's what I want to look at. The dignity of the human person and its relationship to reason and faith. The second thing I want to look at is the relationship between reason, consciousness, and science. Got that? Settled. Now we're looking at Newman here. I'd like to go back again to this picture for a moment. If I can get back to it. This one. Cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. As I've emphasized, there is no direct object, nor even an indirect object, when a human heart speaks to a human heart, and above all, when the heart of God speaks to the human heart. There are only subjects involved, real open subjects. The second thing I want to point out has to do with this little word ad. In the book of Genesis, which was originally written in Latin, that's good Catholic doctrine, it says that God created two things we must remember. And by the way, if you're getting mad at me in this, get mad at John Paul II. I just stole it all from him. The argument is, as everyone probably here knows, there are two creation stories in Genesis. Now, it's the first creation story that's there first and is the important one. The second one is really a commentary on the first one. And the first one says that on the sixth day, God created man. Male and female created he them. Now the point simply is that in the creation of humanity, we are created first and foremost as a community. We are created male and female. We understand each other over against others. Cor ad cor. We are only insofar as we are in relation to others. In the second creation story, the ad comes in, and it says that God created this unit of humanity ad, I know nobody can see it from there, but it gives me fun to write it out, ad imaginem Dei. We are all created toward the image of God. In other words, to put it in very blunt terms, when God was creating humanity at the beginning of time, he was forming out of the dust creatures, a unified social individuals in a unified social network. And as he was creating them as a great artist, he had his eye on the perfect image of God there in the future, namely Jesus the Christ. He was like an artist creating these with that as the model against which he was creating them. And they were created free, so that they could grow as the image of God toward the likeness of the fullness of the image. Now, what is the image then in which they were created? How could you sum it up? Well, the very, very early church fathers and Newman, as a very old church father, suggested that since we were created in the image of God, and since we were created towards this heart of Jesus, which has the Trinity within it, because in each person of the Trinity, all the other parts of the Trinity are there, all the other persons of the Trinity are there, that we must be created as little trinities. This is what, for Catholic teaching, is the dignity of the human person. That is why sometimes people get upset with certain kinds of Catholic theology, because human rights is a second question for us. The dignity of the human person is the first matter. Now, the dignity of the human person means we are created in the image of God, and that means we have a tripartite image. We have a memory by which we sink toward our ultimate source. That's what a memory is. A memory is that by which we remember that out of which we came. So that ultimately, the act of remembering is simply an act of remembering God, the source out of which we came. We have an intellect. And by the intellect, we seek to know the highest truth. It doesn't make any difference where you're born or who you are. If you're a human being, you have a memory and an intellect. And the intellect is always seeking to know the highest truth. And finally, we have a will, which in Latin happens to be a voluntas. Unfortunately, from which we get the English word voluntary, which isn't a very good way of doing it. The voluntas is the will. This seeks the highest good, the highest truth, and this loves the highest good. Or rather, the voluntas, or our will, is that aspect of us which is drawn into the highest good. It is that by which we tend into the good. All human beings seek the good. They're drawn to the good. It's like the good is a big magnet there drawing them, and in fact, here on the screen, which I can't do because I've lost my little machine here that does it, here on the screen, this human heart here is naturally by the voluntas drawn up into this one. It's pulled up into it. That's the voluntas, or the will. Even if I decide that really I would like a triple and 2 donuts when I go to the Tim Hortons, I'm still in somehow seeking the highest. I'm being drawn to the good. I've just mistaken what the good is. I've cut it off somehow, right? Well, some people would say I don't, but at any rate. Now, that's where the dignity of the human person rests. And that's the first point we have to be clear on before I move on into the second part of the talk tonight. Now, once we move on to the second part, forgive me for skipping through these again, we go to Newman, and we go to this passage of Newman. What I want to look now at a moment with you is the whole question of reason and faith. What Newman holds is that this whole tripartite image is consistently operating by a faith-reason action. Faith and reason are not divided. We can look at them as partially divided, but they're not. And I thought I had this right, but it still goes off the screen. The point I want to make is that reason is the faculty of the mind by which a deficiency is supplied, by which knowledge of things external to us, of beings, facts, and events, is attained beyond the range of sense. Newman's first point is that reason always takes us out beyond the range of sense. Therefore, the title of my second lecture, The Sense of the Senseless. Reason is always drawing us beyond sense. It ascertains for us not natural things only, or immaterial only, or present only, or past or future, But even if limited in its power, it is unlimited in its range. Reason is always asking questions. Humanity, in ourselves, we are inevitably questioners. And if you say to me, well, Peter, I'm not too sure about that, you've asked a question and proven me right. You see, the reason is always wanting to know the next answer, and that's normal because the intellect is always seeking the highest good, right? The will is always attempting to be drawn to the highest good, the highest truth, and our memory, we are always trying to seek where we really came from, who we really are. So human life is always on the move, and rational life is one of the best examples of that. And if you look at it reaches beyond the end, it reaches to the ends of the universe and to the throne of God beyond them. Reason itself reaches out beyond itself. This, for example, is what even these new atheists, as I was calling them, would say. And so, having understood this, what Newman goes on is to say that reason is an exercise of the mind, but what he wants to get at is that it is a search into grounds. It is a search into grounds and an ascent upon grounds. And ascent upon grounds. Now, when he makes that statement, it is a search into the grounds of what it sees before us. We have this stuff in front of us. We're trying to figure it out. What on earth is Herb talking about? Right? You're sort of trying to work at that. You're working at that. But as you do that, it is an ascent upon grounds. Reason for Newman believes that reason, any kind of rational act, is already in the very act itself an ascent of faith. It's already a faith act. If you say 1 + 1 = 2, come on, it's as clear as on your face, you've already assented to that. You can see how the 1 + the 1 equals the 2, that's a rational act, but in your very doing that, you've already assented to it. You're already giving faith to it. Faith is already there. So what Newman is trying to do is suggest to us you can't split this faith-reason thing apart so easily. It's there in even the most rational people. If you have a rational act and you don't assent to it, it's not a rational act. If you say 1 + 1 = 2, but I don't believe it, or I'm not going to use it to build the bridge, you get nowhere. The assent is necessary for every rational act. And therefore, he comes to this conclusion. It comes to the conclusion that if this be reason, an act or process of faith simply considered is certainly an exercise of reason. Whether it be a good exercise or not is not the question. It is an exercise of reason. Now, what Newman was convinced of was that every human being does this, that reason and faith are not split apart. They're together. And in our actions of gaining knowledge, we already give assent to that knowledge, and an act of faith is inherent there. When we have certain material that comes to us, we hear the story, the Christian story, the gospel. We get the stuff of the story. We read it, we think about it, and we assent or not assent. Even to say, I believe it's all garbage, is already an assent. It's already an act of faith. You can't escape faith. That's his point. Now, you can't split them up. What he goes back to is a very old traditional notion of faith-seeking understanding. And I'm going to leave this on the screen for just a few moments because I want to look at it with you with some detail. Newman's point simply is this. The act of reason-faith, which is part of the totality of the heart of humanity. The heart is the center of what it is to be a human being. And that heart can be understood as tripartite because it's made in the image of God. And That very image is what keeps us alive. And the liveliness of that is already orienting towards understanding. It is not simply reason that says, I want to figure that out. Faith itself wants to figure that out. And Christian faith is only faith if it's trying to figure it out. Dead faith is the same rationality of a couple of weeks ago where you stand and can't sit in the chair because you're not sure what is going to happen. Faith is life, reason is life, humanity is life. Human beings are single beings who are operative in this world. And as single beings, we are always seeking understanding. Fides quaerens intellectum. Faith seeking understanding. Quaerens is where our word questioning comes from. Now, we all seek understanding all the time. Not just intellectual understanding, by the way. Be careful of the word intellectum. You're in a situation where you don't know what to do. Shall I give my money to this group or to that group right now? You've got to make up your mind. You want understanding. Which is the best place to where's the best place to place it? Do I take this part of what Herb's saying as useful to me, or do I take that part of what Herb's saying? We have to understand it. We are always seeking understanding in both practical and both intellectual and moral ways. Moral decisions are also understanding. Now, the important point about understanding that we have to try to grasp is that when we're looking at Newman, understanding is intellectum. Understanding, intellectum, is grasped. When we come to knowledge or understanding, let's just put understanding and knowledge together for the moment. When we come to knowledge or understanding, Newman always says we grasp it. Now, the Latin word for grasp is prehendo. I grasp. We can grasp something in several ways. Two ways, actually. We can grasp it comprehensively. So you now know that the concept of the memory, as Herb put it, or the concept of the human person, as Herb put it forward, is memory, understanding, and will. You now comprehend that. You can get your head around that. Comprehension means you grasp around it in a way. That's not quite the right etymology, but it will do for now. You grasp around it. Comprehensive knowledge is being able to stand above something and say everything there's to say about it. And that comprehensive knowledge, it is grasped, cum, should be up there with, it's with prehendo, comprehension, is known as scientia. A comprehensive knowledge produces a science. Now, the word in Latin, scientia, first of all, you've just got to clear out of your mind all our modern concepts of the word science. All scientia, or a science, is a body of knowledge that you can grasp around. The chemists put this kind of material together, and they have a comprehensive sense of what makes up the chemical science. The physicists do it otherwise. The literary critics do it otherwise. The historians do it in another way. It's a body of knowledge. That's all a science is. And you can apply the word science to the human sciences, like literature, theology, music, art, painting, and you can apply it to the social sciences, like anthropopsychology, and you can apply it to the natural sciences, like chemistry and the rest of them. By the way, any of you know where mathematics fits in the schema? In the human sciences, not in the natural sciences. Now, that's a science. Science results in a science which is a body of knowledge. It arises from a unity of knowledge by separation. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment. Let's just leave that last line there out for a minute. The second kind of understanding, however, is apprehensively grasped. If you look at Newman's works, consistently, he very, very seldom uses the word comprehension and almost always uses the word apprehension. Apprehension means ad prehendo, to grasp toward a thing. Now, you still know it, You still know it, but you haven't got it round, right? There's a difference between knowing that there are 5 unfilled chairs here, except there's 6. There's a difference between knowing there are 6 unfilled chairs here. Have I counted correctly? Yeah. And that 5 of them have papers on them. That I have comprehensive knowledge there, right? But that there are 2 Irishmen in the room who are going to make fun of me after this lecture, I only grasp that apprehensively, right? Because the Irish are that way. Or if someone, a better example would be someone comes to you and says, can I borrow $10, I'll pay you back Monday. You have no comprehensive knowledge the person will pay you back. You grasp toward the person apprehensively, right? It's that. And apprehensive knowledge is not scientia. It's sapientia, wisdom. It's a different kind of knowing. Now, wisdom is never, in the sense, comprehensively known as a science. It is only ever tasted, and it is absolutely necessary that it involves the act of love. It is possible to reach toward the highest truth by the intellect. It is impossible to reach toward. It is possible to comprehend a certain truth by the intellect. It is impossible to grasp ultimate truth except that one includes love in it and apprehends it. The intellect alone can comprehend, but the things that really count in humanity must be apprehended. The things that really count. Like, will the guy give me the $10 back or won't he? Things like that. Ought I to help this? Ought I to do this or that? Those are apprehensive things, and they always come around by love. Now, the difficulty is that scientia is always open to the danger of pride. Sapientia always requires humility. Scientia is always open, comprehensive knowledge is inevitably open to pride and arrogance because it always stands above things and objectifies them. See, I can see the 3 points here. I've got that. But apprehensive knowledge, or you can't even call it apprehensive wisdom that really counts in human life, that has to include love. And it always requires humility, and it's always an act of the total of the human person, not a part of the human person, this part, but of the total human person, including love and memory, recognizing where one came from, who one is, and open to the other in love. And once that's open to the other in love, that requires humility because it's a cor ad cor, not ad cordem loquitur. Do you see sort of how it works now? Now, the difference, one last point between these two is important. Knowledge is a dangerous thing. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was always questioned. The worst of all the vices was curiosity. We think curiosity is a great thing. The medievals didn't. They knew that curiosity was the desire to control something for no apparent reason, just to control it. Curiosity is the drive for knowledge as power. Now, what is the danger of knowledge, of science? You know what I mean by science now. I'm not just talking about chemistry. I'm not blasting chemists or physicists or mathematicians or whatever, or applied mathematicians. What is the danger of the scientific mentality? The danger is this, that knowledge, scientia, knowledge, the scientific knowledge, arises solely by separation. By separation. Why can I make fun of my friend Bob Kelly sitting over there? Why not make fun of him, right? He's a Lutheran. Why not? They're picked on, right? especially this week of Christian unity, right? Why can I make fun of my friend Bob? Well, one of the reasons I can is because I know he'll make fun of me when he gets a chance, but also because I know him. Now, I know Bob better than I know some others in here who I've just met for a moment or so. Now, I know Bob better. I have more knowledge of Bob than I have of Dr. Perrin. I've known him longer. We've had all kinds of contacts and so forth. My knowledge of Bob is greater than my knowledge of you. But what's the trick about that knowledge is that I am therefore more united with Bob than I am with you, David. And the point simply is, however, that how am I united with Bob? I'm united with Bob by a greater degree of separation because I know more about him. I'm united to Bob through the knowledge I have of him, and as I get more and more knowledge, I think I'm closer and closer and closer to him, but in fact, I'm only close to him because of all the information I have about him. I've got to get through all that stuff to know him. That's the problem with science. It's dangerous. Sometimes Catholics get this all mixed up because, well, sometimes Christians get it. Everybody gets all this mixed up. This is why in the better translations of the Bible that came out in the 16th century, it says Adam knew Eve. They talk about carnal knowledge. Sexual intercourse is not love, it's a form of knowledge. And it fools you into thinking you're related closely when you aren't. Knowledge always relates and ties by separation. It's dangerous that way. Love unites us directly with the thing loved. Knowledge always results in an objectification of the other. Love always overcomes that objectification and allows the other to be a subject like you, a core to a core. Now, this is an extremely important point in Newman's system. He doesn't ever spell it out specifically this way. I've tried to run it through for you in this way if I could. But I want to, before I close tonight, do a few other things. I want to make a few comments on this in some ways, and I can't do all of it. By the way, some of you have probably figured out that I've only done about a third of what I planned to do, so it's all right. It's out there in cyberspace somewhere, right? But what I'd like to do, first of all, is talk a little bit about how knowledge arises, comprehensive knowledge. We have a picture by Rembrandt here, and this is a picture of Rembrandt, and he painted here Aristotle contemplating the head of Homer. Now, you'll remember 2 weeks ago, some of you, that I looked at origins, the question of origins. I want to do an origins question again very quickly. Here is Homer. Now, the Homer that he's contemplating is not this Homer. It's this man, Homer the blind poet. And to understand Homer, we have to understand also another man who lived about 400, 500 years after him, Hesiod. Hesiod, if you want to impress people with the name. It's interesting, there's the blind Homer. Look at the eyes, look at the eyes. And here is the seeing Hesiod. And this Hesiod is seeing, but he's sad. Because if you read Hesiod, who lived around, let's say, 700 years before Christ, let's just say that for want of a better guess. He wrote a book called The Theogony, and in the Theogony he said, I want to understand my origins. And when he looked back, he said, I'm going to go back to the beginningest that there is. That's his word. In the beginningest, what was there? He's looking back in the world that he simply sees that he can know by the intellect alone, and he sees the beginningest, and as far back as he can get, there must have been something called earth, there must have been something called chaos, and there must have been something called eros, or love, or desire, and that's as far back as I can get. When Homer tried to do it, Homer tried to look back as far as he could to his origins. And what did he think? All I can find is war and the wrath of Achilles. Human anger and war. And now I've got to make a world and try and understand the world with this sort of knowledge. Well, roughly, let's say, around the same time as Hesiod's writing, glad my good friend John Van Cedars isn't here tonight, he'd tear me to shreds. This man wrote a collection of books called Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and so forth. Now, I know you know he didn't write them, but we're going to believe he wrote them, right? That's Moses. Notice Moses' look. Moses have a different look than Hesiod. The skull of Hesiod is looking straight out at all of us sitting here and pondering the beginning of all of us and the wrath and the war and the troubles that are there. Moses is a different figure, or we can call him the Yahwist if you want to call him the Yahwist. I don't know who you're going to call him. The writer of Genesis. He looks outward beyond himself, as does this Moses. They look out beyond themselves, and what do they see? They see not, this man or the author or the Genesis writer doesn't see the beginningest. He sees the principium. See, because he spoke Latin. Right? He sees the principium. En arche in Greek. In principium. In the primary principle. Not in the beginning. In the primary principle, God created the heavens and the earth. In the principium itself, God created the heavens and the earth and those of us that are here tonight, including the chairs and so forth. What is that principium? That principium is the Word of God itself. In the Logos, God created this, the principium that's there at the beginning. But what does this figure give us? What does this author tell us? Very much different than the Greek author. What this author tells us is there's something before, a God who is there before the principium. The Homers and the Hesiod's, brilliant geniuses that they were, can only look back in time this way. Moses reveals to us a beyond. A beyond that is in the beyond the principium in which we are created, and not only a principium, a principle, a primary principle there at the beginning, but a beyond that goes beyond that. The seventh day is a day of rest. It's a beyond the 6 days of creation in some sense. In other words, it's not just, he doesn't just take you back to the beginning of time and says, I can't know anything about it, and here's where the end of time is. It's a nasty, brutish, and short, and everybody will die. He gives us an arche, a beginning, and a telos, an end. And we can see beyond the end in the Sabbath. Now, that's what we mean by revelation. That's the revelatory act of the Yahwist author. Now, this results in a different kind of understanding. Once you have that notion of revelation, that kind of a concept, the Greeks can be marvelous, fantastic developers of the intellect. And they can understand all kinds of things about memory and all kinds of things about love. But they're caught in that startled gaze of Hesiod, looking out in sadness upon the world he knows. Whereas the Yahwist, the writer of Genesis, we'll say for the moment, or whoever it was, or whatever one, Moses, looks out beyond himself and doesn't even look to take the shoes off his feet because he knows the very ground on which he stands is holy. He can know that is holy only because he's looking out beyond himself. In other words, what this revelatory pattern does is put together the transcendent, nature and transcendence, nature and supernature, that I'd indicated the other week are pulled apart. Now, what happens in this is that in this world, someone has to come into it. And Adam and Eve come into it. And Adam is given a task. His task is very simple. One of the first tasks he does is to name. And this is my final point, really. He names. Well, no, it's not my final point. Cheer up. You've got these lousy seats for another 5 minutes. He names. Adam is giving the task to name the animals, to name the trees. Now, a much later writer of Revelation will in fact look at this carefully. Notice how fast I'm going through these sheets. And he will suggest, it's the author of the Book of Wisdom. Now, the poor Lutherans in the room don't have wisdom. They kicked it out in the 16th century. But the rest of us do, right? We got it. And in Wisdom it says that when God created the world in the Principium, that is, in the Word of God, through Him, with Him, in Him, Catholics will understand the phrase, that's how the world was created, in that Word of God, by that Word of God, through it, in it, and with it. When that was done, what was at the base of the world we live in, God ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. Now, this is a commonplace in the Middle Ages, that in the creation, God established everything by measure, number, and weight. By measure, individualities were created because they were measured as individualities. By number, we were related one to the other. There was an order established. And by weight, the weight of a thing is the way it sinks into its fullest love. The weight of love. And God created it this way according to the Book of Wisdom. Now, when Adam is asked to name the animals, to name creation, when he's out there naming creation, he is hearing the Word of God. Only those who were here last week will catch the point about hearing. He is hearing the Word of God, which is an act of grace. And hearing the Word of God, he names the things according to the words that he has heard. Natural law is not the law that an 18th century deist would think about. Namely, that at the beginning of time, God created the universe this way, that way, and the other way, put these laws into it, set it rolling down, and it goes by certain irreparable laws. That if then we can figure out the laws, we can figure out how this works. And our knowledge is a knowledge of the laws. In this system, our knowledge of natural law is not attributing something to something, but naming the things we see in the universe with our ear to the Word of God, who created all things in measure, number, and the weight of love, according to the Book of Wisdom. Now, that's a radically different view of natural law. And in his discussion with Habermas, Cardinal Ratzinger suggests this kind of a new approach to natural law is necessary in our time, talking to people like Habermas. Now, it's a fascinating development. I was going to take you through the Middle Ages and show you how encyclopedias arose and how they screwed up everything. And then I was going to take you to this place, Oxford, which is Newman's place, and show you how this isn't Oxford, and this isn't really Oxford, but the room in the back there, called the Senior Common Room, is Oxford, because universities aren't institutions, they're bodies of individuals seeking the truth and loving the good. But I can't do that, and besides that, I haven't got my check for tonight yet, and if I say too many nasty things about universities, I won't get it. So we'll go back to conclude. We'll go back to two pictures we saw before. This is Raphael's School of Knowledge, School of Athens. It is after the break that I talked about, and at the center of this School of Athens, the School of Reason, the School of Philosophy, we have these two people. Reason, on the one hand, on the right-hand side with Aristotle, and faith with Plato on the other hand pointing up, and they can't agree. Across the room, as those of you who were here the first night, we have the triumph of the Eucharist. What happens if in fact sciences are bodies of knowledge, as I suggested, and we want to live only comprehensively? We'll end up with more and more bodies of knowledge, and these bodies of knowledge will keep growing. Now, what happened in this? Well, what happened was this. The body of chemistry grew like this. The body of physics grew like this. The body of biology grew like this. The body of some other psychology grew like this. And what we as Christians did way back was say, but psychology and chemistry and physics can't answer what's between the gaps. What's in the gaps between the sciences? We said that must be where God is. God must be in the gaps. Except then science expanded out. And there was no longer any room for God in the gaps. What we forgot was that there is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. What this kind of world has done is a terribly fragmentary world. We have chemists who tell us that that chair is, 99% empty space because of all the atoms flying around, in between there. We have physicists who tell us it's absolutely solid. We are coming to a world in which we are having ever-increasing fragmentation of knowledge. What do we do? My suggestion is we seek God not in the spaces, not in the gaps, because God isn't in the gaps. But we find God in the fragments. In this particular picture, which I started off 3 weeks ago as a bad guy picture, I would like now to be the good guy picture. The center of reason was the dismay between, the break between reason and, the center of the School of Athens was the break between reason and faith. The center of the Eucharist is the Eucharist itself. The fragment toward which, it seems to me, the center of the Christian faith occurs, and the only way in which we can talk seriously with the new or the old atheists. God is not in the gaps. God is in the fragments of this fragmentary world. I am responding now only from within my way of faith. I happen to be a Catholic. I can respond only within my fragment. There's no other fragment I can speak from. This is the fragment of my faith. You know the word my and I here aren't really me. They're, what do you call them? An e persona in English departments. It's the fragment of my faith. I can only respond from that. It is given to me and it is activated in me. I can respond only in this way as the final ultimate way. There is no way to the Father but by the incarnate Word, the way, the truth, and the life. Now some of you in this room will cringe when I say that. You will say, oh no, there's that Catholic triumphalism again. It just come in by the back door. Well, yes, maybe. But there's something else here. When I say that I see things this way, I recognize that I too am a fragment. I recognize I'm a fragment because with Eve, I have looked solely on the apple and missed the tree. In fact, it's very, very interesting to look at the Old Testament, the Genesis story, how hearing is, the difference between hearing and seeing there. Very interesting. I'm also interested in the Mass. Do you ever think that maybe the first part is all about hearing, and then only after you've listened really carefully in the first half, can you see in the second? Can your heart be lifted up? the heart be lifted up? At any rate, that's another thing. But the point simply is that I am a fragment. I'm fallen. Once I fell, I no longer was part and parcel of the whole. I looked upon myself and the other and realized that we were naked. It's a fortunate fall in some ways. I see others and know that I am naked. I know myself as individuated and the other like me. I am not the whole. I am merely a piece of the whole, and yet I apprehend the whole. This is why faith is so important for Catholic Christians, and those of you who were here last week will know what I mean by Catholicity. I don't mean it in the narrow framework in which I was talking about earlier. What I am getting at simply is that the question is not, does God exist? The question is, where is God really present? It is not the existence of God, it's the presence of God, the heart of God. And here we have it. In this particular figure, the heart of the ever-greening universe, mirroring the measure, number, and weight of the Catholic whole before the center of the Church, a united Catholicity. That's it.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. We have time for just a few questions. I think we'll take, we'll try to get 2 in, maybe 3, depending on length and so on. So if you do have a question, please go to either side of the room. You'll see that there's microphones there. When you ask your question, make sure it is a question, first of all, and keep it quite short, because typically Peter will have yes, you got it. So anyway, if you can make your way to either side of the room and for a question. As people are making their way there, I just have to say, Peter, that I'm currently writing a book on Catholic ethics, which so much of what you've talked about today would be my first chapter in this book that all of you will read it, I'm sure, one day. But get this, read through Peter's notes and then read my book. That would be perfect. A really strong message for ethics in here.
This means you didn't steal it from me.
Not yet, no.
No.
That's right. Any questions? Clear as mud covers the territory? I have a bunch of questions, so we see one moving. Yes.
Yeah. Your view of science, I don't really recognize in any science I've done or seen or read about. Coming from a, you pointed to the scientia, that the scientia, that's this surrounding of knowledge, knowing implicitly. Science, any scientist I've ever met, doesn't talk that way,
yeah.
Doesn't believe that way. Theirs is always a tentative, always, based on the probable and the possible. It's only religious groups that I see, speaking authoritatively and saying, that somebody can speak infallibly. So I'm just not noticing,
Yeah.
There's a disconnect there for me.
Yeah, the disconnect, I understand your disconnect, because in fact, many of the people the natural, social sciences and human science people that I know are exactly the same. In fact, in terms of things that go on within the university, generally speaking, the framework of science is exactly in line with what Newman says. Reason is always moving out beyond itself, and there's always an ascent involved that moves to a higher ascent as it moves out. In other words, reason and faith aren't split that way. I would suggest, however, that in the old atheism that I was talking about the first week, we do have that other kind of science that I was talking about that is problematic. in which there are suppositions that we now know this, this, and this, and therefore we can decide on this in this way. That's all I'm talking about. Yeah.
This is hopefully just a brief question getting on the tripartite image of God in man or humanity. If will is seeking the highest good and intellect is seeking the highest truth, then I started to think about the Plato's sort of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Now, would memory then, if it fits with that, and I'm not sure if it does, that's my question, is memory in seeking the source, seeking the highest beauty? Or are those things not related in that way?
If you follow the theological program within Catholicism that I do, namely that of von Balthasar, the answer is simply yes. Yeah. Except that in this case, the source is also the end. Because it rings round. I mean, in the falling into the deepest source, remember the weight of love? See, the point is we need to talk rhetorically here. Some of you weren't here last week when I talked about the nature of rhetoric. And so we're talking rhetorically here, not, if I may put it this way, logically. But the weight of love is where our memory leads us, right? It leads us into our deepest source. It's the weight of love. It sinks us down into that love. But in that sense, it's one and all with this. These aren't three, in one sense, these aren't three, for people like Newman, in fact, for Augustine way back, these aren't sort of three separate faculties. They're the activity of the whole. And so even as this weight of love, which is already this love here, drawing us down into our ultimate source, will be drawn there by the beautiful, because what that into which we tend is the beautiful. These are the so-called transcendentals. But there's a terrible debate in Catholicism about this. And if there are any Thomists of the strict observance in the room, they would be terribly angry with me. Because in fact, Thomas never says, he never says that the beautiful is a transcendent. But I'm working on the principle that the beautiful is a transcendent, and that it transcends all things, and that just as the truth and the good here is, I would say the beautiful is here too, but you can't really quite separate them out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, Peter, the strict Thomists left the room when you were giving your spiel on natural law.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So they're long gone.
Tosos, they call them.
Right.
Oh, I know there's one here yet, but
he's not going to raise his hand.
He's actually a friend of mine, so I won't.
We have time for one more.
Peter, I'm just going to go back to the statement that you put up earlier by Newman, in which there was a claim made about two options. Right? You had this in the first week, that there are two rational options. Do you remember that quote?
Oh, the chair on the floor.
No. Either atheism or Catholicity.
Oh, Newman's thing. Yeah, either atheism or Catholicity.
Which sounds to me like a very comprehensive and not a very humble claim. So I'm wondering, there seems to be a tension there. And related to that, isn't that a departure from the patristic view in which unbelief is really demonic? I mean, it's not a rational option. And your stance as recognizing that you were a fragment, all that stuff, seems to me to be a more liberal, stance than the patristic golden age, whatever.
Yep.
So if you could address those two.
Sure. First of all, I think since it's Newman's, and he's a very humble man, he's going to be a saint, so he's got to be. Well, we'll wait until he's declared a saint, and then we'll see. I'm partially jesting, but I do think that when Newman made that statement, he was making it in great humility. And I don't like to reduce it to a sort of psychological state, but he, using the word psychology in the biggest sense of it, when Newman looked out on the world as he saw it, in all humility, he could only say there's the only choices he had. In other words, it wasn't a comprehensive question. It was, these are the choices I now have. There may be other choices, but I don't know what they are. But I know these are the choices there.
All convictions.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, on the question of, since I mentioned von Balthasar, you probably immediately said, aha, see, Erb's trying to keep all the patristics in there and so forth. No, Newman also said something else. And that is, I know not how it is in a higher order, but here below, to live is to change, and to have changed often is to be perfect. One of the main points, I think, about Catholicity, and I hope most of you know that I don't mean that as a single denominational matter. One of the great points about Catholicity is that we recognize that the Christian idea continues to shift and change. And so what I was trying to get at the end here, by in fact putting up the Raphael picture again from the first week, is that this is the world we're in. And I can't run back to the Middle Ages. And although I can resource myself, and I hope the church, in the patristic writings, I can't run back to the patristic writings. I can't remake that world. I am an individual now. I am a liberal. This is a liberal, maybe it's even a post-liberal world already, or a post-secular world, as a friend of mine in the room would say. But this is what I live with as a Christian. The kingdom of God is not yet here. I continue to reach out and move on. And this is why I repeat again that great phrase by Newman when he's talking about the nature of the church and the idea of Christianity. He says, Christianity will be shifted and buffeted and hit in all directions. I know not how it is in a higher world, but here below, to live is to change, and to have changed often is to be perfectum, that is to be brought through to my and the world's fullness. Does that kind of help?
Yes, it does.
For those of you listening to this podcast, this section has been added after the original talk. I realized that I had promised in the first lecture that I'd give a fair bit of detail on the word science, and I didn't get to it in the talk. And what I'd like to do is just add a few moments now to outline what I mean by the word science. Some of this you've already listened to in the talk itself, but I want to flesh it out a bit, since one of the questions also raised the problem, and I should have done this. The point that I want to make about science is as follows. The word science comes from the Latin word scientia, and in Latin the word scientia simply means a body of knowledge. Now, any science then is a body of knowledge, or rather any body of knowledge is a science. For this reason, you could call psychology a science, because it is the science of human behavior. It is made up of all the information we have at this point about human behavior. Chemistry is, of course, the science or the knowledge of, the body of knowledge we have about chemical relations and reactions. This word science, however, has recently been reduced to refer only to the natural sciences. And this is a problem. In Newman's day, and of course I think it should be also in our day, this should be expanded. We do talk about the social sciences, but then we get into a battle over whether they are quantitative or qualitative, whether they're experimental or humanistic in psychology and sociology. And in the humanities, the so-called humanities, we've pretty much scratched the word science completely. My suggestion is that we should go back to talking in the university about sciences, bodies of knowledge that fall under the category of natural, such as physics, biology, zoology, botany, chemistry, and then the social sciences that fall under anthropology, sociology, psychology, of course, and then the human sciences, such sciences as philosophy, music, literature, and above all, theology. Theology is also a science. It's a body of knowledge. Now, that's what I mean by a science, simply a body of knowledge. This body of knowledge results, however, not simply it isn't simply a body of knowledge. It's the body of knowledge creates something else. As the body of knowledge is gathered together over time by those people pursuing that particular area, it begets its own rationality, so that a chemist will have a certain kind of scientific method. He or she will use rational method in a certain way that will be somewhat different than the way in which, obviously quite a bit different than the way in which a sociologist will do it. Now, there are two major points that I want to make here. The first one is that the rational method that arises is the rational method that arises in only a specific, limited body of facts. It doesn't apply across the board. You can't take in every single case the rational scientific method that a chemist uses and apply it to the rational scientific method that a biologist uses. For example, the table here, let's say for the moment, is made of wood. If a chemist is analyzing it, the chemist will come to the conclusion by the chemist's rational method that the table is 90% or 99% empty space because of the way the electrons fly around and there's space between them. The biologist, of course, isn't interested in that question. His rational method will arise to make the decision as to what kind of a table this is. It's an oak tree rather than from an oak tree rather than a maple tree. It's of such and such an age rather than such and such an age. So the rational methods shift. What each of the rational methods do, however, is reflect what I said earlier in this lecture about the number, measure, and weight of the way in which the Word created reality in the beginning by measure, number, and weight. So that what we have here, there is a natural law out there to some degree, but it's not the natural law in the way an 18th century Catholic would have thought about it, or in fact the way a contemporary scientist, whatever we mean by that word, thinks about it. The natural law is rather created by the Word of God when God speaks into the world. His creative act, let there be light and there is light, let there be this and there is this, let there be human beings, we can say for a moment, and they are. That speaking of God, the creative Word of God, is a creative word that creates, as we said earlier in the lecture, by measure, number, and weight. Now, as human beings, like Adam in the beginning, we name the things we do. We name those realities that we see in front of us. We name the scientific realities by means of our resonance with the Word of God. We bespeak the measure, number, and weight of things, thereby explaining the law of things within the sciences we speak. And our speaking this, our enunciating of the Word, is in some ways our enunciating of the Word in which and toward which we were created in the beginning. It's not an exact parallel to the exact Word at the beginning. It is only our naming of this, our human reflection of this. Now, this is a different view of natural law, and certainly a different view of science than was primary, let's say, from roughly the 17th century until very recently. And it's this kind of thing that some theologians are now looking at with greater attention. The second thing I want to mention about the science is that science, like all the sciences, theological science and let's take a natural science, all work on the principle of tradition. We sometimes think that the word tradition only fits theology. It doesn't. The tradition of a science is inherent there. Scientists, let's say chemists, natural scientists, or sociologists, social scientists, or literary human scientists, all work on the basis of a large body of knowledge that has been gathered over the years, put together, sometimes sorted out in different ways, sometimes errors in it created anew, sometimes errors in it corrected, sometimes changed slightly as time goes on. And each person working in a science is dependent on the great tradition of thought within that science. No person works simply on their own. So in this sense, theology is a science. We work out of tradition in the same way as a chemistry. Chemistry is a science in the same way as sociology is a science. We work always on the framework and within the framework of a community. So sciences, what we call the natural sciences, are not that different from the human sciences or theology as a science, because both work within this tradition at large and continue to reshape it as they name things into the future.
Thank you, Peter. I have to tell Peter what to do. Not many people get to do that, do they, Betty? Thanks, Peter, for a wonderful talk. To bring this evening and this lecture series to a close, I would like to invite Dr. David Perrin, President of St. Jerome's University, to come and say a few words.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klein and Dr. Peter Erb. What an adventure you have brought us on these last days and weeks. An exciting adventure indeed, and you've led us down a garden path. You said what was old was now new, and what was new, you said, was old. To add to some of the confusion along this pathway and into the garden, you also said that the world was enchanted, and a fella called Raphael painted a picture of that and showed us that things had changed, but to where we do not know. You said there's no more old, it had become new. There's no more new, it had become old, and no more enchantment indeed. My, what to make of all of this? We learned in all of the apparent confusion, humanity had taken the best seat in the heavenly throne room and decided to reduce human perspective to the limits of human reason. We found out, Dr. Erb, through your reflection, that God changes in all of this, not that we asked God's opinion, and that shapes us into another conundrum. We find that we decided our humanity to take it upon ourselves to delve into human affairs without God, at least the God of love reflected in Jesus with the Spirit. And we subjected God to the same scrutiny experienced in the lab of a scientist. Only this time, we used noble tools such as philosophy, private judgment, reasoned argument, and objective thought. We thus, you told us, Dr. Erb, we thus created a God that nobody could believe in, not even those with the most sophisticated capacity for mental maneuvers. Indeed, this God was unreasonable. Here we hit the central roadblock, at least one that I picked up during these 3 weeks of expose. We hit the central roadblock brought forward from the lecture last week. There are limits to rational discourse. Rational discourse creates dead ends, and indeed creates dead gods. We learned there is an end to which reason cannot go beyond, and a new atheism was born from our own laboratory of rational thought. What you have given us, Dr. Erb, is given us clarity around this, that our apologetic of reason has failed miserably. And enter Newman, or should I say Aristotle disguised as an Anglican. Enter a fresh approach. Newman, in his retrieval of Aristotle, rejects rationalism to adopt rhetoric as the framework for delving into the mystery of God. And you led us along this pathway into the garden. Here, God is understood not as a distantiated object, but as a friend, and indeed a lover. Heart speaks to heart, you said so many times. cor ad cor loquitur. Logos, the Word, is born as the vehicle for all divine and human life in this scenario. Faith in this model is born from a reasonable experience of human and divine charity called grace. All of this has led us to the dignity of the human person, the speaking to each other as persons, not objects. This relational quality of the human person forms community, you told us, and in this, God's image is reflected. The human being is drawn along the pathway to the highest good and the highest truth. The frail creature that is our humanity is taken up into the loftiest of adventures. Indeed, taken up into the divine. You told us that our faith constantly seeks understanding of the drama of human encounters. This gives us the dynamism of life, and as a result, life makes sense. You told us that life makes sense, but not in an absolute way, but one that trusts, that dares to err in humility and in love. We are left as human beings to gaze along the pathway, to gaze upon the world, knowing that which we see before us is indeed holy. This is the garden into which you led us, the pathway which we have taken these last weeks. Only when we hold all of this holiness together will we live the adventure of faith. We need to seek God not in the temporality, where the gaps show us nothing, but rather, you said, we seek God in the fragments of life, those encounters of human heart, of lost love, of celebrated love, of love that has slowly transformed the human heart to ever more assuredly hold on to the tenuous nature of the other, the one before us, the fragile one along the pathway into the garden. And so as we conclude our adventure, all of us, these last 3 weeks, let us gaze, let us look, let us allow that Logos, which has first given us life, draw us up into the mystery of faith. And all of this is a very reasonable thing to do. Dr. Peter Erb, thank you so very much for this reflection. Thank you for enriching us these weeks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Perrin. Just again, a reminder, if you would like to be a part of the St. Jerome's lectures and Catholic experience, want to hear more information about what we do here, the lecture opportunities and so on, we have a sign-up sheet out in the foyer. Please stop by there and fill that out. Also, there are brochures out there with upcoming lectures, and there's an information sheet there if you wanted to give us your contact information as well. So our next lecture in this lecture series will be in March with Vincent Miller. Vincent is a wonderful theologian who has written on such things as consumer culture, and now he's turning his eyes toward globalization and how it actually changes the human person. So it falls very well in line with what Peter has been talking about these last 3 weeks. I want to give my own personal thanks to Peter. Ever since I came to St. Jerome's in 2002, I have always experienced Peter as a man of wisdom, a man of knowledge, and truly a man of love. And he's always willing to give that his graduate students, his colleagues, many of which are in the audience. I mean, this is a true testament to Peter. And it's wonderful having everyone here celebrating the kind of gift of thinking together, the joy of thinking. So thank all of you for coming to St. Jerome's. And I want to thank Peter. for working with us throughout this series. He's welcome anytime, and please join me in welcoming or in thanking Peter. So this brings. They're standing, Peter. So this brings this evening in this series to an end. I want to wish you all a safe home, and until we see you all again, I wish you God bless.